It's great to welcome to the program today David Wallace Wells, who's a National Fellow at the New America Foundation, columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine, and author of the book, The Uninhabitable Earth. David, great to talk to you today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
So let's just dive right into it. Increasingly, there have been both sort of sober and specific claims about how long until the Earth may become inhabitable, what uninhabitability means, like what do we really mean when we say that? And there have also been some sort of very erratic caricaturizations of some of the claims that have been made about this that are often not based in science. So if we're even going to start thinking about this issue, like what would it mean for the Earth to be uninhabitable? What are the metrics, or how should we be thinking about what that would even look like or mean? How would we know if the Earth was, quote, uninhabitable?
Well, technically, it would mean that no humans were able to live on it. And I think that we're very, very far from having that be the situation we're living in. I mean, probably even in a complete worst case scenario where everything goes absolutely haywire and we don't do anything to adjust our consumption patterns or production of carbon, we're probably talking about several centuries at the absolute fastest. So it's not a scenario that is coming in the near term, but what is coming quite close is the devastation of particular parts of the planet, many of which are now quite densely inhabited, which could make them much, much harder to live in. So as soon as 2050, many scientists who study the direct heat effects of global warming, which is to say literally how much the human body can take, how much temperature and humidity the human body can take before risking heat stroke and possibly heat death, say that many of the biggest cities in South Asia and the Middle East would be so hot in summer that you wouldn't really be able to go outside during the day. You certainly wouldn't be able to work outside during the day without risking heat stroke. And these are cities that today hold 10, 12, 15 million people. And it's possible that as soon as 2050, which may sound a little far away, but is just the length of an American mortgage from now, those cities would literally not be able to support human life in the way that we understand it today, which is one reason why the UN expects that also by 2050, we could have as many as 200 million climate refugees or possibly more.
Right. So what we're talking about, in a sense, is the underestimating that is taking place as to the effects of climate change. When we're talking about habitability, we're talking about parts of the planet, we're talking about in particular ways. I mean, some that I think of are sea level rise, putting certain cities underwater. It's not the Earth is uninhabitable, but we're sort of being pushed further inland in some sense. When we talk about pollution from industrialization and continued burning of fossil fuels, it's not uninhabitable, but it's how much technology are we going to need just to be able to breathe when we go outdoors, or will we not be able to go outdoors at a certain point? What are some of the other ways that in the immediate we should be thinking about these restraints on the habitability of parts of the planet?
Well, actually, air pollution is one that I find really striking. There was a major study I talk about a lot in 2018 looking at just the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. And to give your audience a sense, we're already at 1.1 degrees of warming above what's called the pre-industrial average. That puts us already outside the entire window of temperatures that enclose all of human history. So the Earth is now already warmer than it's ever been during the entire history of humanity, stretching back all through the time in which we evolved, we developed agriculture and civilization and modern civilization, so that you can think of really everything we know about human life as having developed under climate conditions that already are out of date. That's where we are now, 1.1 degrees of warming. And we're on track for about 4.3 degrees of warming. But just between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, these scientists estimated just through the impact of air pollution, which is not narrowly a result of climate change, but is produced by the same thing that produces climate change, which is to say the burning of fossil fuels. They estimated air pollution would kill 153 million additional people. And when I tell that to audiences, when I tell that to interviewers, when I tell that to friends, their faces go ashen, their eyes go wide. They think, my God, this is a completely unconscionable level of suffering. It's death at the scale of 25 Holocausts. And they're right. It is unconscionable. And yet, 9 million people are already dying every year from the effects of air pollution. So we're already turning away from some of these impacts today, even though we might like to think that we wouldn't turn away from them and we would find a moral obligation to address them. We see already that we're dealing with many of these impacts without doing much to address them at all. And to take another example, I recently wrote a piece for New York Magazine about the California wildfires. I spoke to Eric Garcetti, the mayor of LA. He's 48 years old. The year he was born, 60,000 acres of forest burned in California. The year he was elected mayor, 2013, it was 600,000, a tenfold increase. The year he was re-elected mayor in 2017, it was 1.2 million acres, which means twice as much as had just been the case 4 years before. And last year, 2018, 1.9 million acres burned. So these trajectories are inescapable to anyone who lives in California. And the scientists say that, again, just by 2050, which is, again, if you're buying a home in California, it's just the length of a mortgage from now. Just by 2050, scientists expect that wildfires will get at least twice as bad and maybe 4 times as bad as they are now. And in the second half of the century, the estimates are even more dramatic. There is some responsible science, I think it's a little high, but there's some responsible science that says that by the end of the century, 2100, wildfires in California could get 64 times worse, which would mean something like 75% of the state of California would be burning every single year. Now, again, I think that there are reasons to think that those numbers are a little high, but they give you a sense of just how dramatically transformed the planet can be by even one of these impacts. And there are so many that you can't even count them, hurricanes, extreme weather, drought, famine, the public health issues that arise when mosquitoes that used to be trapped in the tropics are flying as far north as the Arctic Circle, as will be the case very shortly. There's a relationship between temperature and war, so that for every half degree of warming, those who study it suggest that we would get between 10 and 20% increase of conflict. So if we end up at 4 degrees at the end of the century, which is what we're on track for, we could have twice as much war as we have today. And there's a major impact on economic growth, so that by the end of the century, 2100, we could be dealing with at least 20% smaller, perhaps 30% smaller global GDP than we would have without climate change. 30% is an impact that's twice as big as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. There would be parts of the planet that would be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. So this is a sort of inescapable, all-encompassing threat. I look at these impacts, and they seem really dramatic. They seem terrifying, as they should be. I also think that we'll find a way to adapt and live among some of these impacts, but what it will mean for the way that we organize our societies, the way that we organize our politics, how much empathy we extend to those around the world, these are really big open questions. I think they may be as profound as the ones about direct climate impacts, and we haven't really yet begun to think about just how scrambled our lives will be by this force, which is, I think, as big and all-encompassing a force as, say, modernity was in the 19th century, or, you could say financial capitalism was in the late 20th. It will dominate this coming century in ways that we don't even yet know how to anticipate.
When I cover this stuff, I want to be as precise and accurate as possible as someone who lives in the United States about how bad or not bad of an actor the U.S. climate skepticism, climate denial sort of status quo is in the grand scheme of things. And there are obviously lots of reasons to think that the United States is a bad actor here, and acutely so. There are some defenses, like, for example, listen, most of the carbon is not being burned in the U.S., even though disproportionately it is being burned in the U.S. In sort of raw numbers, it's not. The U.S. is just one player. Even though these other countries are doing some stuff, they're still just trying to slow the growth of the problem rather than actually reduce the size of the problem. How bad of an actor is the U.S. in all of this?
It really depends on your perspective. So, I think it's important for everyone to understand the U.S. is now producing about 15% of carbon emissions globally. That puts us in second place, which is not a good place to be. But China is producing about twice as much. They're at 28% of global carbon emissions today. That's one perspective. But another perspective is historically, so how much we're responsible for putting the carbon up in the atmosphere to begin with. And from that perspective, the U.S. is responsible for actually, I think, over the majority of all carbon emissions that have ever been produced by humanity. So in that sense, we have a kind of, there's a moral imperative for us to act, even if today we're doing better than some other nations in the world. In terms of, denial and skepticism, I personally think that those forces are completely villainous. I think that the fossil fuel companies are doing great damage to the future of the planet, and the way that they've captured at least the perspective of one of the two parties in the U.S. is a tragedy and an outrage. On the other hand, when you look around the world at countries where fossil fuel interests have much less political power,
yes,
and governments that are much more committed to green policies, at least rhetorically, basically none of them are doing any better in terms of reducing carbon emissions than the U.S. is. And that makes me think that the problem here may be a bit deeper than simply the force of denial or climate skepticism, and that we may be distracting ourselves and sort of giving ourselves a pat on the back when we needn't as American liberals, when we point the finger at the other side and say it's all their fault. I think the UK is doing a bit better than the US is. There are a few countries in the EU that are doing a little bit better, but it's generally speaking, we signed the Paris Accords 3 years ago. All of the countries of the world, no major country in the world is on track to meet those commitments.
Right.
Even if all of them did, we'd still be on track for north of 3 degrees of warming this century, which would be completely catastrophic by almost every metric. The only nations in the entire world that are even compatible at this point with the goals of the Paris Accords are Morocco and Gambia. 2 countries, that's it. So I think we're dealing with a much, much bigger problem than simply the force of denial in the U.S., and the way that the Republican Party has been captured by those forces. On the other hand, I don't want to let those people off the hook, because I think they are very much fighting on the wrong side of history and doing a kind of moral damage to the country and the world, even if practically speaking, I think that their role is a bit overstated sometimes.
So you said a few minutes ago that you do think that in the face of all of these coming negative consequences, that we will in many ways find ways to cope. But I want to sort of go a step further than that, which is to say, is the fact that you chose to have a kid while writing this book a sign that in a more general sense, you're optimistic that this is something humans will deal with appropriately?
I think of myself as an optimist, yes. I mean, I think it's really important to keep in mind to think about what you're basing your expectations off of. So if you're hoping that the world is going to stay roughly as it is today, which is already a quite degraded climate where 500-year storms have hit Houston in the last 3 years, or we've had those catastrophic wildfires, these unprecedented heat waves, the biggest storm in 50 years to hit Mozambique, followed by an even bigger storm less than a month later. All these kinds of impacts that would have been unconscionable just a generation ago, we're already in that kind of unprecedented, harrowing climate situation. And if you're hoping to preserve this climate, that terrible, damaged climate, even that, I think, is hopeless. There's no way that we're going to stabilize the climate and anything like our present situation, which means, from that perspective, that's a strong argument for pessimism. But I like to think that our best baseline of expectation is the track we're headed on, which is to say 4 degrees of warming. And I think there's quite a lot that we can do and will do to avert that level of warming. I think it's really important to keep in mind when I talk about some of these really catastrophic impacts, the wildfires, the economic impacts, the twice as much war, all that stuff. These impacts can seem overwhelmingly large, but they're also a reminder that we have power over the climate. They're a reflection of our power over the climate. If we get to that 4 degree level and we're dealing with all of those impacts, it will be because of what we do from here through the end of the century. That means that our hands are on those levers and we can theoretically change course. Theoretically, there are a lot of human obstacles in the way that are preventing us, or at least slowing down that action. But theoretically, it's up to us to write the story of of our near future. And I think, part of the reason that I had a child, I think partly it's that I'm living in delusion and compartmentalization like so many other people, and want to live my life as I want to live it, as so many other people do, not thinking about these issues. But to the extent that I was focused on the climate question and thinking about the choice to have a child, I think, I was very mindful of the fact that this story is not yet written. It is up to us to write it. And a huge range of outcomes are possible, from a little bit worse than we have today to quite dramatically worse. And I think on climate, as with everything, you have to fight for the kind of world that you want to live in and you want your loved ones to live in, rather than giving up before the story has even been written, has been determined. And I think for all those reasons, I think it's up to us, and we should, seize the opportunities for optimism and for action, rather than retreating into fatalism and despair. Because the truth is, even though the climate as we know it today is already gone, there's no hope for saving it, the story is not at all over yet. And we fall into a trap often, thinking of climate as a binary system, where it's either there's no climate change or climate change is here, or it's livable or it's catastrophic. But it's a spectrum, and every tick upward of temperature that we get is going to make life worse, with more pain and more suffering around the world, most of it concentrated in the global south. But every tick upward that we can avoid means that life will be better, healthier, more prosperous. And I think we owe it to all of us and our children and grandchildren to fight for that future as much as we can every day.
The book is called The Uninhabitable Earth. We've been speaking with the book's author, David Wallace Wells, who's also a national fellow at the New America Foundation and columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine. David, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk to you.